thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for the important work you're doing here with automatic registration. That was actually the second plank of my campaign for Secretary of State, and I'm proud to say California has enacted that as well. But we're going to talk tonight about getting big money out of politics, but just as important is getting voters back into politics, and the first step of that is getting them registered to vote. So that's a very big deal, and boy, we could sure use some more people with that kind of thinking in the U.S. Congress. So good luck with that effort. It's truly an honor to be here tonight. I've been working on money in politics issues for 20 years now. But for 5 years before that on environmental issues, including a lot of ballot measure campaigns. So I think I've probably worked on 20 or 25 different ballot measure campaigns over the years. And I'm pretty sure I've never seen a volunteer signature gathering effort anywhere near this substantial. I think I've been on a few that maybe got 100,000 volunteer signatures, but nothing like this. In my lifetime, I have not gathered 20,000 signatures. So to do that is truly phenomenal. Yeah. And you know, I think that is a testament not only to the incredibly disciplined hard work that I know you all did, because I know what it takes to do this kind of thing, but I do think it is a testament to the depth of the seriousness of this problem, and in some ways the character and resolve of the American people to rise to this occasion. You don't just see signature efforts like this come out of the dirt on any issue. So I truly think we're living in a special moment, and so I'm honored to be here with you. I thank you for coming. I know you have many other things that you could be doing tonight, and so the fact that you're taking time on top of all the time you already spent gathering those signatures to come tonight to learn more about this issue and talk more about that issue, means a lot to me. So I'm saying that not only to be polite, but also the fact that you have limited time is a central point that I make in this book. And I know it seems obvious, right? We all know we have limited time, but if you think about it from a political point of view, between juggling our jobs where we've got, more things to do than we have in a workday. You've got sick kids you've got to take care of, or sick parents or siblings. You got chores to do at home. We like to eat and sleep and all those, If we're lucky, I know you all are spending 2 hours on this particular night taking in some political information, but I figure at best the most active citizen on average has about an hour a day to think about our public policy problems and issues and politics and whatnot. And that is a pretty scarce resource. It's limited, right? And because our time is limited, we limit political speech all the time and don't even think about it. Walk into pretty much any city council meeting in America, and there'll be a public comment period where you can stand up and say anything that you want for 2 minutes. Sometimes it's 1. In Los Angeles, it's 1. I've been there. Sacramento, we're trying to get it up to 3. But everyone agrees there needs to be a limit. Because otherwise, if one person, blabs on for an hour, nobody else gets to talk. I've seen some city council meetings like that where the members do that. But, in Congress, you may find out, you can't do that. They limit your speech quite severely. Watch C-SPAN, and they spend half their time arguing about, the gentleman from Virginia has 60 seconds left. Will you yield? Da, 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 da. Very strict time limits on political speech in the U.S. Congress. The United States Supreme Court limits political speech. They will tell each lawyer from each side, here's exactly how long your brief can be. Do not exceed 15 pages. There's a funny story in the book about what happened to BP Oil when they tried to use a smaller font type to squeeze more. They got in trouble. And likewise, when the oral arguments come, it's 30 minutes for each side. They are limiting speech. And they're doing that to further the First Amendment, because freedom of speech for the people means we limit the duration and the volume of speech of any single person so that all sides can be heard, so that judges can make decisions that are more wise and more fair, so that legislators can balance all the viewpoints in the country and come to a better decision than they could themselves. And again, I say this as if it's obvious, but it is not human nature. This is something that we learn, and I discovered that when I was volunteering a few years ago in my daughter's first grade classroom. And I tell you, you walk into a first grade classroom, they all talk at once, all of the time. And the teacher spends the bulk of the time saying, sit down, quiet, you. And you notice you've all been trained at this, right? Because you're all sitting down, not talking, listening to me. And sometimes I think that 5 of the 9 members of the United States Supreme Court must not have gone to kindergarten, because this seems to be a totally foreign concept to them. And they're saying, so what I'm talking about is actual speech, right? Like you physically speaking with your mouth, talking about a political issue. Money is obviously not speech. And can you imagine what would happen if you're in a city council meeting and somebody waltzes up to the microphone and, digs into their pocket and says, I got $10,000 here. I'd like to buy an hour's worth of time. You all get 2 minutes, I know, but an hour, please. Thank you. And if, the parliamentarian said, well, of course, the First Amendment demands that, you would fire that parliamentarian in about 5 seconds. And yet, that's what the Supreme Court is saying, is no, you cannot. You have to allow that person to buy that time. And a lot of people have heard of the Citizens United ruling, right? How many people heard of that? 6 years ago? But really, that logic came 40 years ago in a ruling called Buckley versus Vallejo that was passed in the wake of the Watergate reforms. Big problem, right? Remember, President of the United States resigned, big problem. Congress reacted to that very big problem. So it's important to remember that we can force Congress to act when our problems are big enough. And the Supreme Court gutted 2/3 of that law. And what they said in their logic in doing that is, the concept that government may restrict the speech of some elements of our society in order to enhance the relative voices of others is wholly foreign to the First Amendment. See, they didn't go to kindergarten. And they've obviously never been to a city council meeting or even a Supreme Court argument where we do that. But in seriousness, the argument that they would make is that, well, of course, we limit speech in a forum, right? If there is a roof on your head, we all have, we're judges, we have limited time, we have to consider all of these cases. Legislators, they have limited time, they've got thousands of bills, so you limit each time. That's how you can have a debate. But when there's no roof, when there's no forum, there should be no limits. Forgetting that you have limited time, right, as voters. But really, even outside the building, we don't uphold to this unlimited theory when it comes to real people trying to speak. Talk to, where'd my friend go, but, folks of 99 Rise who get arrested for speaking too much. I got arrested with them in Sacramento for speaking too much on the state capitol. Talk to the folks of the Occupy movement who spoke too long in Zuccotti Park. Or the folks of the, I don't know what you call Ammon Bundy's movement, but who are speaking too long, according to some people, on a public property in the state of Oregon right now. And we limit all of their speech too, not even to enhance the voice of others, but so that the public can use public property to do things like bird watching or enjoying Zuccotti Park or enjoying the steps of the California State Capitol. I was staying at a friend's house in Portland, Oregon last night and was amazed. He showed me a picture of this sign he used to have up on his own house, on his own property, that said, "End corporate rule." And then he showed me the citation he got of $50 a day from the city of Portland if he did not take that down for violating their sign ordinance. So there's a bonus chapter in the book, so it's not actually in the book you can get today, but if you go to the website, whenmoneytalks.com, there are 3 additional chapters that my publisher limited my speech and said, Derek, they don't fit in the book. You got to get rid of them. I said, I'm not getting rid of them. I will give them away for free on the website. But the last one is about the very real threats to free speech that regular people face all the time. Anyone here get kicked off of someplace when you were trying to circulate a petition saying, no, you cannot speak here? U.S. Postal Service property will not allow you, you know. So when it comes to real people trying to speak, we get restrictions all over the place. But when it comes to billionaires trying to spend money on paid speech, the court says, oh no, can't limit that. And this comes from a fundamental just misunderstanding of reality, I think. And this is something that has changed since the founders' time. You know, in Thomas Jefferson's day, or James Madison's day, the amount of information that a citizen could consume in their lifetime, a normal average citizen, not Jefferson who had his own private library that became the Library of Congress, but just a regular citizen, you know, that's about how much information is in a New York Times edition today, right? That's great, right? We're very well informed from our various media outlets, but we are really inundated with information unlike any society ever in the history of the planet. And, you know, think about it, right? Your email box, you have 200 emails unopened, right? Your voicemail box is overflowing. You've got 200 channels on cable TV. It is overwhelming. And the way we deal with that is we set up filters to figure out what's the most important information for me to read, right? So you've got a spam filter on your email. You've got a mute button on your TV for those annoying ads. And there's an information guru guy who I quote in the book called Clay Shirky, who actually says, well, really, there's no such thing as information overload, only filter failure. And, you know, I think he's right. And this leads me to sort of the second key point of the book. The first one is, you know, we have limited time. The second one is advertising, or paid speech, what I call paid speech, is designed to cause filter failure. And there's a fundamental difference between you as a reader seeking out speech when you buy the New York Times or tune in to Fox News or whatever your source of news that you choose. And what you're doing, no, seriously, what you're doing is you're choosing an information filter that you trust, right? And some people trust Fox News because they say, I share their values and I want to hear information that's important to them, and that's an absolutely legitimate choice for people to make. That's entirely different when somebody pays to put information in front of you, actually interrupting the program that you were tuning into that you did not solicit. It would be like if Ted Cruz suddenly walked on the door up here and kicked me off the stage and said, please excuse me, I have a 30-second information session that I'd like to give you. You'd say, get off the stage, Ted, go get your own room. We didn't come here to hear you. That's what advertisements are. And they are screwing up all your information filters and forcing speech upon you that you didn't seek out. And so if we draw a line between free speech that you are paying for, and really the words of the First Amendment say freedom of speech, which is really freedom of conscience to believe what you want and speak with your own mouth without being sent to jail, and then it's freedom of the press. And what the founders thought of the press is much like we think, it's, you know, newspapers that you buy, not advertisements that somebody else pays for you to read. So if we draw that line, that can cut through a lot of the confusion that we hear from opponents of campaign finance reform. Senator Ted Cruz took to the floor of the U.S. Senate about a year and a half ago when actually a constitutional amendment was being debated, and he said, well, if we get money out of politics, it'll mean that the government can jail the producers of Saturday Night Live. But Saturday Night Live is not an advertisement, right? That's a program that people tune in to watch. So I completely agree. We do not want the government jailing producers of Saturday Night Live or Fox News or the New York Times or a Citizens United organization making a movie that people pay to watch. But we also don't want advertisers deciding the information that we get to hear. Ultimately, the choice of what information you're going to filter out and what information you're going to consume, given that you can't consume but 5% of the information you're bombarded with, should be up to you. And anything that infringes upon your choice of information is really an infringement on your liberty. So if we're worried about government infringements on liberty, let's first look at this distinction between free speech and paid speech. So that's my assessment of what the court has gone wrong. It's a different frame to think about money in politics than the way we normally talk about it, which has been corruption, right? Where the presumption is sort of being, well, yes, we're willing to accept some limits on freedom of speech in order to prevent corruption. I do think money in politics causes corruption, but I don't accept that actually putting these limits on money in politics in any way harms freedom of speech. I think it enhances it, much in the way that a 2-minute limit in a public city council meeting goes. So the problem is, as eloquent as that argument might be, we have 5 members of the Supreme Court who disagree, and probably would disagree even if I could talk to them personally for 5 hours across a dinner table. Come on, really, just hear me out on this. So the challenge then for the citizen is, what do we do when we are confronted by 5 men wearing graduation gowns who refuse to let 80% of the country govern ourselves as we want to, which is not only a money in politics problem, it's a fundamental problem questioning whether we still actually live in a democratic republic, I think. So one approach is we could wait for a new Supreme Court. There'll be a new president. That new president will probably be able to appoint several new justices of the Supreme Court. There are 4 of them that are getting on up there in age. But maybe not. These are some ornery people who can stick around for an awful long time if they choose to. They're pretty healthy. So I have some concerns about whether or not that would actually work. If it did, I would happily take it. But I would still say that we shouldn't rest there, because 10 years later, the composition of the court could change again. And we could see the foundational meaning of the First Amendment ping-pong back and forth every 10 or 15 or 20 years based on the whims of who has a heart attack or feels like retiring on whose watch. And I don't think that's a way to take self-government seriously or to take our Constitution seriously. And it still leaves this lingering question in my mind of like, well, who's really in charge here? We could have waited for King George to die too, and maybe the next king would have been better. But that's not what we chose to do. We sacrificed a lot and risked everything so that we could govern ourselves. And I think we need to push back on the judicial branch right now. And there are 2 ways I want to highlight of doing that. One, you're familiar with. We could pass a constitutional amendment. And there are 2 routes to doing that you may be familiar with. One is for 2/3 of Congress to draft the amendment, which is how we've passed 27 amendments so far. The other possibility would be for a convention of states to draft an amendment, and then either way, 3/4 of states, those 38 state legislatures, need to ratify the amendment. That's one good reason for organizing in state legislatures right now, is to pave the way for that. And I think this is a more permanent solution than just waiting for the court to change composition. And it's also something that citizens can directly engage in and fulfills the promise of our democracy. George Washington said in his farewell address as he was leaving the presidency, the basis of our political systems is the right of the people to make and alter their constitutions of government. And if we're saying it's now become too hard to amend our Constitution, even when 80% of us want to, I worry we've lost the promise of the framers, and I'm not willing to let go of that. So that's why, even if we do get a new court, I will keep pushing for a constitutional amendment. There is a 3rd way to go about this that most of us don't think of very often, but that is also to return to a fundamental principle of the framers, that the Supreme Court is not the sole institution in our country responsible for interpreting and enforcing the Constitution. The framers expected all 3 branches of government to check and balance each other, not only in passing laws like the Congress does and enforcing them like the executive branch, but actually in interpreting the laws. The right of judicial review was not in the original Constitution. It's a practice that the court started doing and that we the people have accepted. And I think that's fine, but I don't think that they're the sole entity that should be playing that role, and that's certainly not the intention of the framers. And there's a great quote by Thomas Jefferson in the foreword of the book to that effect. But where we really saw this play out in fairly recent history was the Great Depression, where you had Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected President of the United States. He was terrified for the future of the country. It really looked like, the economy was so bad the republic could fall apart. Moved very aggressively to implement the New Deal. And for the first 4 years he was in office, the Supreme Court struck down almost everything he got through Congress. And this was a pretty grave situation. So he ran for re-election basically on a campaign against the United States Supreme Court, saying, they're wrong, I'm right, vote for me. And they did, and elected him overwhelmingly, and gave him overwhelming majorities in Congress. And he then found a way to pick a fight with the judicial branch that didn't wait for anybody to retire or die, that wound up having the court uphold the New Deal. And ultimately, constitutional scholars feel like this actually changed our Constitution in as permanent a way as a constitutional amendment would have. And it's interesting because most historians look at this as one of his big failures, right? He proposed packing the Supreme Court because there's no guarantee, or the number 9 is not in the Constitution about the number of justices we're going to have. He said, well, let's have 11 or 13. I'll add a couple more. Nothing illegal about that. And in fact, we'd had different numbers about that before, but there were some qualms about that, even from his own party. But by raising that issue and challenging the institutional authority of a Supreme Court that I think really had gone off the rails at that time and was damaging the future of the country, Owen Roberts, who was a justice at the time, no relation to John Roberts today, I don't think, he flipped his vote. And he started upholding the New Deal by a 5-4 vote and stuck with that. And other justices have stuck with that since that time. And the New Deal, and the concept that government can regulate the economy through things like minimum wage laws and maximum workweek laws and all these other things is now considered not constitutionally controversial. And this is known as the switch in time. He switched just in time before they were going to pack the court to save 9, right? So the switch in time that saved 9 was a result of executive leadership challenging, the checks and balances between the 3 branches of government. The court blinked and saved the country, arguably. So I think that's an approach we need to look at now. I'm not suggesting that our next president should try packing the court, because that's sort of been tried and didn't work, but I think we should be creatively looking for other opportunities to do that. And we do have other examples in our history that are not so rosy, where people, executive branch officials have defied the United States Supreme Court, and some of them pretty ugly. Like in 1958, when the governor of Little Rock said, I'm not going to go along with the Supreme Court's order to desegregate schools, and I'm going to call out the State National Guard to block African-American students from going to high school in Little Rock. Well, the federal executive branch, Dwight Eisenhower, said, no, you're not. I'm going to enforce the United States Supreme Court opinion on this, and I'm going to send in federal troops, and those kids are going to that school. The mayor of Little Rock happened to agree with him as well. And that was a case where the executive of that state was out of step not only with the United States Supreme Court, but the federal executive branch and the federal legislative branch. And so that failed. And I think that that's appropriate. And that's the check and balance on sort of runaway executive power, is I claim, it's only justified for the executive to push back and challenge the court's authority in cases where they can honestly claim to be acting on behalf of the people. And I think Franklin Delano Roosevelt could definitely claim that in 1936 and 37 after running a campaign explicitly on this issue, explicitly challenging the court, and the people weighed in and said, yeah, you're right and they're wrong. And I think that that's what Owen Roberts was recognizing. I think he was not only just saving his own institution from being weakened, I think it was, in fact, a recognition that the people have spoken on this, and our Constitution permits government regulation like the New Deal. So that's a thing that I think states could be looking for creative opportunities to challenge the federal court. Montana almost did it when they continued to uphold their 100-year-old ban on corporate contributions after the Citizens United ruling, ultimately defied the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Montana State Supreme Court thumbed their nose at the U.S. Supreme Court and by a 7-2 vote said, oh yeah, we uphold that law. We know the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't, but we do. Well, that's an interesting moment. But then the Supreme Court struck it down and the Montanans folded their tents. But I kind of wonder what would have happened if they didn't. You know, would Barack Obama have sent in federal troops to Montana to say, you must allow corporations to spend money in your elections? Maybe, but maybe not, right? And that's, again, a way for both branches of government to sort of throw it open to the people. And, you know, if the people of Montana thought the governor was being reckless, they can unelect him, they can recall him. There's an electoral accountability there as well. Now, none of these things are easy to make happen, right? Politicians don't just risk their careers forcing a constitutional crisis with the courts or passing a constitutional amendment against really their own incumbent self-interest, since they do a pretty good job raising money themselves. So I've spent a lot of time looking at the issue of, well, how do we get Congress and executive branch officials to do something that they may not want to do? And when I was researching this, you know, in the late 1990s, I ran across this practice of voter instructions. And I want to talk about it a little bit tonight because that is exactly what I-735 is. And there's an amazingly long and proud history of this in this country that you all should be aware of as you go out and explain this ballot measure to your fellow citizens in Washington. So let me just read one quick excerpt from the book that will do a better job explaining it than I could if I just read it. But it says, sometimes voters don't want to rely only on their elected representatives to speak on their behalf through resolutions. They want to speak directly, not just as individuals, but as the entire electorate, the people. It has been generations since Americans really thought about what it means for voters to collectively tell our elected representatives precisely how we want them to represent us. But it played a central role in passing the 17th Amendment. And there's more on that later in the book. But constituent instructions began in England and were used by nearly all of the early American colonies prior to independence. Colonists gathered in town meetings to not only elect representatives to legislative assemblies, but to specifically instruct those representatives on certain positions to take on their behalf. Quite different than the direct democracy practice used today in 24 states through the initiative practice, whereby citizens can enact laws themselves and completely bypass legislators, the instructions process embraces Republican form of government. Instructions give elected officials clear directives on how we want them to represent us, but leave the details up for our representatives to debate and finalize. And here's the part I really wanted to read. This preamble to instructions from Boston residents to their representatives in 1764, so this is pre-Declaration of Independence, explains the idea. We, the freeholders of the town, have delegated you the power of acting in our public concerns, in general, as your prudence shall direct you, reserving to ourselves the constitutional right of expressing our minds and giving you such instructions upon important subjects as at any time we may judge proper. So this is, you know, they would send someone to go represent them. They sent delegates to the Continental Congress. Some of them gave them explicit marching orders and said, we want you to declare independence from England. And those delegates did that. And that's what led to the Declaration of Independence. Then the states sent delegates to Philadelphia to draft our current Constitution. Some of those delegates were under explicit instructions as to what that Constitution had to look like and could not look like. And they followed those instructions. And then after the convention, when they were going around selling the idea to the states, many of those framers, as part of the deal, said, hey, we know it's not perfect, but you'll be able to amend it. And in fact, you'll be able to use an instruction process to do that, so you can hold your elected officials accountable. And one framer from Delaware, a guy named John Dickinson, said when he was pitching the Constitution to his constituents, saying, it may be perhaps advisable for every state, as it sees occasion, to form with the utmost deliberation drafts of alterations respectively required by them, and to enjoin, that was the word for instruct, it's bind, their representatives to employ every proper method to obtain a ratification. Now, the interesting question that's been debated ever since that time is, well, how do you enjoin an elected official to follow their instructions? And this ultimately, I think, will be the crux of whether your effort is successful here in Washington or not. When they were debating the First Amendment in the Congress, they actually thought about putting a right to instruct in there, right to petition, freedom to assemble, right to instruct. And they decided not to because they didn't know how that could be enforced. Do you sue your member of Congress? Do they automatically lose their seat if they don't follow the instructions? How are we going to enforce this? Well, we'll just let people do the instructing and then leave the enforcement up to the people through the political process. So it was considered, though, a morally binding practice. And 2 U.S. senators who later went on to become president actually resigned their seats in the U.S. Senate rather than disregarding the instructions from their voters. That's how strongly they felt about it. And as late as the late 1800s, when California was drafting its constitution and actually did include the right to instruct in our state constitution, one of the delegates there explained the thinking of the time about how strong these were supposed to be. He said, "The people have a right to instruct their representatives, and the representative has a right to refuse to obey those instructions. Both have rights. But if the representative cannot conscientiously obey those instructions, he should resign." Right? That's, after all, the job you're applying for. I would like to represent you people in the Congress or in the State House. And so how can then I say, well, but I don't want to represent what you've just told me to do? So this was once taken very, very seriously. And I think when you put together your campaign for Initiative 735, you should be laying the groundwork for this expectation. We are not just here to spout our mouths off. We are here to call you to take a very specific action, and we expect that you'll do it. And if you don't, and I understand, if you can't in good conscience fulfill your public duties, fine, resign your office, right? Kim Davis didn't think she could perform marriages in the state of Kentucky. Okay, get a different job where you don't have to do that. If you're a conscientious objector, don't join the Army. If you don't want to follow the will of the people, don't take a job as their elected representative, because that's what those people do. But so that's the way historically Americans have thought about this, and I think that's the way we need to start thinking about it and talking about it again. So it's not enough for us to win Initiative 735 on the ballot. We need to win it with such a grassroots presence in every single congressional district in Washington that every single member of Congress of every single political party feels like they have no choice but to listen to what their constituents have done, or they'll be replaced. So that's the challenge before us. It's incredibly exciting how far you have come already. Let me wrap up my comments and throw it over to questions with just a couple of closing thoughts about what you can do. So first, thank you for devoting a couple of hours of your time tonight. I'm going to beg you and plead with you to devote 5 or 6 more hours and actually read the book. And I get that that's a big ask because your time is scarce and I don't have a $1 billion ad campaign to put the book in front of you in 30-second sound bites on TV ads. But do that, and actually at the end of every chapter, there's a little tip on one thing you can do, and it ranges everything from stamping messages on your dollar bills with the Stamp Stampede to running voter instruction measures. So read the book, share it, with other folks, literally lend them a copy or tweet about it or Facebook posts. It's helpful if regular readers can write reviews of these things on Amazon.com or Goodreads, things like that can help get the message out. I mentioned there the bonus chapters that you can share with friends for free, available at the website whenmoneytalks.com. Also, while I'm spouting out websites, let me remind you, I know that we have a couple folks filming tonight, and so if you're one of those people not in the audience but watching this on TV and you want to get involved with this effort right now in Washington State, go to the website for WAMEND, which is it wamend.org? WAMEND, WAMEND.org. Open up another window on your browser right now, click it, join them while you're listening to me wrap up. Really important. It's something you can do. And then a final caveat. I am not proposing these ideas about differentiating paid speech or this one tactic of voter instructions as the only thing we need to do. And I feel like sometimes even in the kind of pro-democracy movement, we get a little focused on this is the one reform and everybody needs to be doing this and only this because it's so important. And I say, no, we need to do this. It needs to be part of the mix. We also need to end gerrymandering. We need to end the constitutional doctrine that corporations are people with constitutional rights, which is another part of the Citizens United ruling that I didn't talk about tonight, but there are other great books on that. Corporations Aren't People by Jeff Clements. Tom Hartman has a book on equal protection. That's another whole battle, the battle for voting rights, on and on and on. And rather than saying we all have to focus our efforts on one strategy or tactic, I more think about it as like, what did we do the last time our republic was totally threatened in World War II and we weren't sure we were going to make it? We did everything we could think of as hard as humanly possible, right? We didn't go, well, let's just put everything in the Normandy invasion and hope that works. It's like, no, let's do that in the Manhattan Project. Let's do espionage. Let's bomb Dresden. And we didn't know what would work. And I don't think we know right now what's going to be the thing that will work. But I do know that something will, because I am 100% confident that the status quo is not tenable. It is intellectually bankrupt, and it is politically bankrupt and unsustainable. And, I get all the time, oh, Derek, this is impossible. You're never going to overturn Citizens United. Anyone else heard that, right? But just in my lifetime, in college, I studied the Soviet Union. About 4 weeks before my graduation, guess what? There was no Soviet Union. And, none of the political scientists that I were reading saw that coming because that looked like an immutable object. We saw the apartheid regime in South Africa fall in less than a year. And the way these things happen, I think it's like an earthquake, right? Where you don't see the plate tectonics moving because they're not moving, but pressure is building up until a point when it can no longer hold. And then when things move, they can move very fast and very quickly. And we saw that 100 years ago in this country when women got the right to vote. We banned corporate contributions from federal elections. We created the Citizens Initiative process. We got the right to vote for U.S. senators, all in about 10 years. So incredibly big change happened very quickly, and I think that will happen again, and I think it may be less further off than a lot of folks think when we reach that earthquake or political fault. So don't let anyone tell you it can't be done. Keep doing what you're doing, and I will now limit my speech so that we can get some questions for you. But thank you. So we have
we have two microphones. You can just line up on either side to ask questions.
We'll start over here.
Yeah, I know you write about it in the book, but I haven't read this part yet. But you promised to say a little bit about what an amendment should look like. Can you do that fairly briefly?
Yes. I just turned off my computer with my notes, but there's a whole chapter on this, and and again, this is an amendment only to fix the money is speech part, not the corporate personhood part. You could combine this language into one amendment and deal with that, or you could pass them two separately, or a judge could write these words. And again, I don't believe that these particular words are magical. I think they're a little bit better than several versions that have come before, and I'm confident that they'll continue to get better as we evolve and work on this. And, process-wise, I actually think we'll come up with a much better wording through a collaborative crowdsourcing process of having the whole country think about it and debate it through committee hearings in the U.S. Senate than having one judge and a couple of clerks spend a couple hours on it and writing a court opinion. So I think an amendment will get a superior language to a court ruling. But again, as I said, I will still take a court ruling that overturns Citizens United tomorrow if any justice is interested in doing that. But let me see if I can actually, because it's a short amendment that I've been proposing, I could just read it to you. Here we go. To advance democratic self-government and political equality, ensure a fair and balanced debate, and protect the integrity of government and the electoral process, nothing in this Constitution shall prohibit limits on the amount of money spent in or given to election campaigns or political advertisements. And I like that language a little bit better than a lot of the existing drafts that are out there that talk about regulating or limiting money expenditures to promote political viewpoints. And the trouble with that term, I think, is, well, some people think that does sound like the New York Times, right? You do have to expend money to print the New York Times and to hire reporters and all those things, but nobody thinks of the New York Times as a political campaign or a political advertisement. So those are some of the distinctions that, that's a draft that I'm throwing out there. I think it's worth thinking about, and I think we'll continue to improve on it. Next question.
Well, an attorney once told me when I was trying to gather signatures from him and his wife that our I-735 didn't go far enough because it just urged legislators rather than having the stronger terminology that you just mentioned. So really, what will our amendment achieve?
I do prefer the word instruct or charge as opposed to the word urge, but there's no legal difference. There's no legal way to enforce any of those things. So it comes down to that moment when somebody has ignored them and you're saying, well, it's time for you to resign. And they go, well, I didn't because you only urged me, not instruct me. I don't think that's going to wash. Yeah, there's always ways we could tweak the wordings of these things, but I think the intent's pretty clear. And I think any member of Congress, the intent's pretty clear, and they better listen up. But ultimately, the enforcement will come in whether or not voters choose to remove somebody from office who doesn't follow this. They're urging either way. Yes?
Hi, Derek. In observing the 2016 presidential elections unfold so far, it seems to me that the contest between Hillary Clinton supporters and Bernie Sanders supporters is a contest between those who believe that the status quo is basically okay and looking for basically a third Obama term versus those who believe that, no, the status quo is not okay and we need really, really big changes in a fundamentally flawed system. If you would agree that the status quo is not okay and that we need big changes, what do you think is the best way to convince Hillary supporters or the country at large that we really do, that the status quo is not okay and that we really do need big changes?
Well, I don't actually think hardly anyone thinks the status quo is okay. I think the difference of opinion is about whether or not we can do anything about it, which kind of gets back to this fundamental question of, do we still run our country or not? Because if we can't do anything about the status quo, what happened to George Washington's promise? But I do think there is something extraordinary going on in this election, and this has been building up in past elections, but there are three things happening. One is small donors are actually playing a bigger and bigger role. And that's in part a technological thing, right? It started with Jerry Brown in 1992 throwing out a 1-800 number. Remember that, right? And then Howard Dean and Barack Obama started, successfully using online. And these were tools that allowed us to raise large amounts of small contributions in ways that were so much more cost effective than direct mail that small donors could really start having a big impact. And when you look at Bernie Sanders' fundraising numbers, it's historic, it's epic, and part of it's that technology. But there's way more to it than technology, right? The other thing that is happening, and I talk in the book about we need to change the political calculus of incumbents. Because right now, and Mitch McConnell spells out this calculus very clearly in a 1994 letter to his colleagues in the House that got leaked to the Washington Post, where he says, "What are you doing supporting campaign finance reform? We would be foolish to throw away our ability to compete. We killed this last year and we all got reelected, so shut up," in so many words. And the calculus was at the time that the advantage of big money is more than the disadvantage of being crosswise with your constituents on this issue, because people don't really care about this issue. Well, the advantage of big money is less right now for the third reason of we now have our own media sources, right? Social media, Twitter, online. We've got people filming here who don't work for one of the three networks, I think. Bernie Sanders hasn't run a single ad in California, and let all my neighbors seem to have heard of him, right? It's because they have Facebook. So I'm not saying big money doesn't matter, but I am saying we have some new tools, and I think people are way more mad about this than they have been in the past. And those three things, I think, are changing the political calculus. It remains to be seen if they change it in this election or not. But I do think a lot of the appeal of both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump is saying, I'm not taking money from super PACs. I'm not doing that. And, in the past, that would be called unilateral disarmament and complete suicide and stupidity. But I think they're getting more support for doing that than they've lost in funds. So when other politicians start seeing that, oh, maybe actually the way to get reelected is I need to be for this. That's the calculus that changes. And I'm not one of those who say, oh, we need to wait until control of Congress changes from one party to the other or this and that. I think what needs to happen is for maybe 2 or 3 members of Congress to lose their seats because of this issue. And that could happen in a Democratic primary, a Republican primary, or a general election. But look at the power of the NRA, right? They run the show no matter what party is in Congress. And they don't unelect a lot of people. But they sometimes do take out 2 or 3 people for crossing them, and everyone else runs scared. 2 or 3 people get taken out over this issue, they will run scared. And I think they are already pretty scared about what's going on with Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And, it may or may not ultimately prevail. I think it might. But either way, they're taking notice. And the political calculus is changing. And that'll, once that changes, all of these reforms that look impossible suddenly become possible. Public financing of campaigns, disclosure, constitutional amendment, gerrymandering, because the plate tectonics will shift. And so that's again why I'm saying we don't focus on just one. We need to have the whole pipeline of stuff ready to go through. I do think this super PAC and money in politics thing is the thing that people are maybe the most aware of and angry about. So it's a great organizing tool. But there's a long answer to your short question. Yes?
Hi, Derek. This has been an unusual initiative, 735, because it's a mostly volunteer initiative. Most of them are paid signature gathering initiatives in the state. And given that, what do you think of the idea, or how can we make them more participatory and more less dependent on money? And also, what do you think of the idea of an initiative process for the federal government?
I like it. It's scary. I'm from California, and most liberals and progressives in California hate the initiative process because one time in the 1970s, the people did something that we thought was really dumb. And it was really, it hurt our state a lot, right? We passed Prop 13. You've got a guy, Tim Eyman, up here who's doing, and so we tend to want to get rid of the process because sometimes voters disagree with us. And I think the better solution in the long run is to educate the voters and persuade them to agree with us. But this is one of I think it's in the last chapter in the book, I kind of start inching there. And if Washington prevails, which I think you will, And if California prevails, which I think we will, we're working on getting a very similar question, Prop 49, back on the ballot in California. I think the next step is a national voter instruction measure introduced in Congress, where we let the whole country vote on I-135. Now again, that wouldn't pass a constitutional amendment in and of itself. It wouldn't be legally binding, but it would be unprecedented. This idea has been introduced before. It's legally possible. There have been bills to do it in opposition to World War II, for example. One of them actually received a floor vote on the House of Representatives. So think of that as your next act when you're bored the day after the election and you're going around asking your members of Congress to obey the instructions in I-135, and someone says, oh yeah, I already said to do that. What's your next ask? You go, well, why don't you introduce a bill in Congress for a national I-135? 735, get that for the record. Initiative 735, wamend.org. Anyhow, I think it's intriguing, and I think it's one of the best things we could do to reinvigorate participatory democracy and let people feel like they really do have a way to make their voice heard. Yeah.
That's a good transition because I wanted to ask you about voter instructions also. I think it's an incredibly interesting concept, but I'm having a little trouble figuring out how we could move into that. I see like on the national level that like if we want to get a question answered by our senators, at least the last time I tried to, you have to fill out an application to do that, and that the congressmen, both the representatives and the senators, go to Congress, and if they're not millionaires to begin with, they're almost all millionaires when they come out. And Barack Obama has talked about, well, the people are more interested in their jobs than our jobs. And even at the state level, I've had to stand up and speak sort of against my 3 legislators at the time, which was really quite difficult to do because they worked as a team and I didn't know as much as they did. But so I don't quite see how I or maybe other people could move into that with such narcissism in our culture, in politics.
Well, it's easy. You just write a $1,000 check to that member of Congress, and then they won't even need the web form. They'll invite you into their office, and you can have a nice chat. This is the way it works. You got to buy access, right? But that is the way it works, right? And again, what's happening is paid lobbyists who are hired by corporations and billionaires are taking up all of your representatives' scarce time because they need to meet with them or they won't get a campaign contribution. So even if they don't always vote with that lobbyist, they're still taking up time that they should be meeting with you, right? So what do we do about this? You don't just show up by yourself. You show up with 10 other people, or 20 other people, or you join an organization. You know, we are fighting this battle with one arm behind our back, but that doesn't mean that we can afford to give up. So we have to find a way, and you know, previous generations have found a way. You think it was easy for women to get the right to vote? You think they got a meeting with their member of Congress? Excuse me, I'd like to sit down and talk about my right to vote. Like, no way. They picketed outside the White House and got arrested and went on hunger strikes, right? You know, see the Iron-Jawed Angels movie. So that is another tactic that I think we are ripe for, is direct action and nonviolent protest. You know, that's part of what ended apartheid. That's part of what ended apartheid in this country and got us the Civil Rights Act. We cannot satisfy ourselves with filling out a web form and going, well, I hope they listen to me. We need to do that, but we need to do everything else and force them to listen to us. And we can, and we have done it before. We've won huge battles in this country, you know, where it used to be only propertied white men can vote. So everything is hard fought, and this is hard fought, and we just have to keep at it. I hope that's a satisfactory answer, but you know, there's no alternative, but dogged determination, the kind of determination that leads someone to go get 20,000 petition signatures. All right, final question, I think. Yeah.
As you know, I-735 and similar initiatives and resolutions passed throughout the country seek to open the door to campaign finance regulation. In and of itself, I-735 doesn't set forth particular spending limits or what have you. I just thought that it's interesting sometime to think about what comes next, only because it motivates me. And two things that have crossed my mind that may be worth consideration, I don't know, but might be motivational are, I've often wondered, number one, if it's possible to turn the courts around against themselves. There's a form of self-defense where when your enemy pushes, you don't push back, you pull.
Jiu-jitsu moves.
So we form a corporation and we sue because we think our corporation ought to be allowed to vote. After all, a corporation is a person. And we form a corporation and we say, a corporation is a person. It should be allowed to beget or adopt children. It should be allowed to run. ExxonMobil should be allowed to run for president of the United States. So push it to its absurdity. The other thought that I wanted to share that sometimes crosses my deranged mind at 3 o'clock in the morning is I had a conversation with Uriel Ybarra, who is U.S. Senator Patty Murray's chief of staff, not chief of staff, but the person who how they have a chief of staff in D.C.
Right.
and somebody
District
here that
representative, yeah.
I don't know what his exact title is. I apologize. So I said to him, why is it reasonable? I don't care if you're on the left or the right, that a George Soros, a liberal in New York City, hedge fund manager, or a Sheldon Adelson, multinational casino owner, should be allowed to Nevada? Why should these billionaires from New York and Nevada be allowed to come into Washington State with big briefcases full of money? So my question to the honorable senator, which I got answered with a form letter, I deeply appreciate your concerns about the electoral, was, my question was, how about this? And I'm speaking now like after we are successful around the nation in amending the Constitution. Only a person who lives in a congressional district can write a check in support of a candidate for a campaign in a district. So whether it's city council or whether it's U.S. senator, what have you. So just two thoughts, one wild and crazy. Corporations are people too. ExxonMobil for president, and the other is, keep your money to yourself.
No, I love all of those ideas, and I would say not after, not next, but now. All of the above right now, and in fact, all of this is happening right now. There is a corporation in Maryland that is trying to get the right to vote. I forget the name of it, but they are doing that. A friend of mine in California, Jonathan Freeman, I don't think I put him in the book, but I should have. He likes to ride around in the HOV lane, carpool lane, with a briefcase in his passenger seat and his incorporation papers there. Yeah, pretty good, huh? He got pulled over by the highway patrol. He said, I have two people in the car with me right here. What do you mean? They gave him a ticket. He went to court. He got his 15 minutes of fame. He was, all over. He got a ton of news. But people are finding incredibly creative ways to point out the absurdity of the situation that we're in. And then, can't vote, can't contribute rule. Imagine if you're in a New England town meeting, your own city council meeting, and suddenly 400 people from New York City, Goldman Sachs employees show up and they'd like their 2 minutes. You'd be like, no, this is our city council meeting, right? You can maybe hand out a flyer outside, but in terms of speaking in the meeting, that's for people who live in the town. Same thing. If you want to write a check and speak about that election, you should be a constituent in that election. The voters of Oregon thought that in 1994, and they passed a ballot measure requiring 75% of the funds that any politician raises has to come from the state of Oregon. the Supreme Court said, nope, money is speech, and you cannot discriminate against the speaker, and an out-of-state bribe is no more corrupting than an in-state bribe. State of Alaska also passed a similar measure, and the Supreme Court of Alaska upheld it. And I think it may still be on the books, and James Bopp is getting ready to challenge it, so I shouldn't say this too loudly, but there is a precedent for that, and I think states should keep passing these. And if the Supreme Court keeps striking them down, we don't care. We pass another one. And same thing on all of these things. It's a way to create new test cases and new pressure on the court, and that's a common sense idea that everyone can agree to. So again, not next, not after. I know you're busy. I know you have limited time. I know you have an incredibly important ballot measure campaign to pass here. There are other great efforts in Washington State, too. Seattle just enacted this great public financing voucher system, and there'll be an effort to take that statewide. Not next, not after. All of it now. I know it's tiring, but you know how important it is, and I know we're all going to win together. So thank you for coming. Let's wrap things up, and happy to sign some books.